Is the body good or is the body evil? What is the ultimate basis of authority in the church? What is the correct way to interpret Scripture? Is Jesus truly divine? Should we call Mary the Mother of God? Is Jesus fully human and fully divine? Is he only one person? What is the proper role of works and grace in salvation? These are some of the serious issues that we've looked at so far in this course. And now it's time for us to turn to some others. Should we have beards? Should we use poofy bread? Now, obviously, I am jesting a bit here in presenting the question of whether or not we ought to have beards, or more specifically, whether or not the clergy ought to be bearded, and the question of whether or not we should have poofy bread, or more specifically, whether or not we ought to use leavened or unleavened bread for the Eucharistic hosts, presenting these things as the serious theological issues we're going to look at next. However, I only jest a bit, because what we're going to be looking at here in this module is Eastern Christianity, and our controversy is the great schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, which is often dated to the year 1054, which is when the kind of final and decisive split between East and West occurred. Although, as we're going to talk about, the division between Eastern and Western Christianity doesn't begin sort of out of the blue in 1054. In fact, there had been a number of shorter divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity in the centuries leading up to 1054. This was a long simmering, long-term process of division between these two halves of the Christian world. And they dealt with a whole host of issues, including the bread that ought to be used for the Eucharist and the question of bearded or unbearded clergy. Another thing, I guess, that is helpful about the little opening there, besides apart from maybe being a little humorous and getting your attention, is that I really do think in some ways this illustrates the distinction between this controversy that we're looking at and the other controversies we've looked at so far in the course. This is a different kind of controversy, a different type of division. All the other controversies we've looked at, you could say there's a clear heresy involved, whether it's Arianism or Nestorianism or Pelagianism. And we don't have that here. This is a schism. That is it's a break in church communion. It's not a heresy, a major error in terms of doctrine. And even if we look at the Catholic attitude towards the Eastern churches today, it's very different than, say, the attitude that the church would have towards modern-day Arians or Nestorians. The Catholic Church would recognize that we agree on the essentials of doctrine with Eastern Christians. We're instead separated by issues of culture, like beards and bread, and we're also separated more decisively, perhaps, in terms of church authority and jurisdiction and things like that. So what we're going to do in this module is try to explain some of these key differences and just give you a sense of this major division between Eastern and Western Christianity, which has shaped Christian history for the last 1,000 years and for a good time before that as well. And we've also looked at some of the Greek-speaking church fathers previously in this course. So we've seen a little bit of, say, Athanasius or the Cappadocians. But there really is this whole other side of Christian history that we've only touched on briefly in this course. And moving forward, our focus is really going to be on Western Christianity. And so this is a module for us to take at least a moment to indicate some of the richness and depth that we could find in Eastern Christianity as well. And hopefully some of you will be interested in this and can continue studying Eastern Christianity and some of the many church fathers and other important things that have come out of the East in your time after this program. But for now, what I want to do is to turn and start by just giving you some of the general sense of the broad development of this gap and this schism between East and West, and to set the context for that a little bit. Now, to really spell out the historical context for this division between Eastern and Western Christianity, we would need to have an entire course in the ancient world. Now, obviously, we're not going to do that here. So we're going to get the kind of Cliff's Notes version of this, if you will. But basically, what you would need to recall is a World Civilization course or World History 1 course at some point or another in your life. And the last two ancient empires that you probably learned about in that course, or a course like that, would be the Greek and Roman empires. The Greek Empire is the conquest of Alexander the Great of much of the Mediterranean world and the Middle East, stretching basically all the way to India and including Egypt and other places. So Alexander conquers all of that in the centuries before Christ. Now, after his death, it splits into smaller kingdoms, but you still get a Greek empire, or a collection of empires, basically, spread over much of the eastern half of the Mediterranean world into the Middle East. And Greek language and culture gets spread all through that region. And of course, that all becomes very beneficial for the early Christians, the missionaries and the letter writers, who were able to use Greek as a common language throughout much of the known world of their day. And so that's kind of the Greek-speaking eastern half of the Roman Empire. When we get into the AD centuries, once Rome kind of has come into power and in control, Rome conquers those Greek kingdoms. And in addition to that, Rome also spreads much further west than those Greek kingdoms ever did, and includes things like Italy and France and Spain, Britain, and much of North Africa. And these areas become part of the Roman Empire, in addition to what Alexander the Great had conquered in his Greek Empire. And in these other western half, or this other western half of the Roman Empire, you don't have that underlying Greek culture in the same way. And these places are more united by Rome and share much more in common tongue in the Latin language. And so they tend to work and do their commerce and their correspondence in Latin. And in the eastern half of the empire, the Greek continues and remains even into the Roman period. And so, of course, Rome builds this huge empire, right? Of course, the greatest empire really that had existed up until their day. And when Rome is at the height of its power in the first few centuries AD, they're able to maintain control of this huge range that contains these very different cultures within it. But as the centuries progress, as Roman authority gets stretched and broken in places, this unity starts to come apart. Right? We talked about in the last module how at the end of Augustine's life in the early 400s, the barbarians are starting to take over parts of the Latin-speaking western half of the Roman Empire. My ancestors, the Germanic folk, Goths and Visigoths and people like that, are taking over parts of France, parts of North Africa, parts of Italy. The barbarians are at the gate, so to speak. Now, there are some ups and downs in that process, that once the Roman emperor moves from Italy into the eastern half of the empire where things are a little more secure, there are times when the emperor will re-exert control over the western part of the empire. But after Augustine's day, more or less the die have been cast. The Roman Empire in the west very quickly disappears and is replaced by these different kind of barbarian people. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, Roman imperial power lasts much longer and lasts hundreds and hundreds of years longer. And it's not until much later in history when Byzantium, the Eastern Empire, is ultimately conquered by the spread of Islam. That's a very long process. So there's a long period during which the western part of what used to be the Roman Empire is now controlled by these different barbarian Germanic groups. And in the east, you still have more or less a Roman Empire with these Greek-speaking parts of the Roman Empire still united underneath it. Now, what happens when you get this change in basically government is that underlying cultural differences between these two halves of the previous large Roman Empire, those differences become more pronounced, right? Without the government authority bringing these two sides together, they grow further and further apart as the centuries progress. And there are a lot of underlying differences between them. The most important, obviously, is the difference in language, right? In the eastern part of Christian world, they write and speak in Greek. And so the Greek phrases, Greek terminology shape the practice of their faith, shape the liturgy, shape the theology, and the doctrinal formulations that they come up with. In the western part of the Roman Empire, what becomes the western part of Christianity, when the Roman Empire isn't there anymore, they're speaking and writing and thinking in Latin with a very different set of terminology. And it's not only that the two different languages use different terms and phrases and grammar, which shapes their thought in different ways. That's true. But another crucial issue is, as the centuries progress, fewer and fewer people are fluent in both languages. So basically what happens is you get two streams of theological development taking place, where after a couple of centuries, those barbarians settle down and start to get a little more civilized. And they become the kingdoms that are the precursors of modern-day Western Europe, right? You start to get the precursors of the Franks and the Gauls and all these other folks. And so they start doing theology, but they're doing theology now in Latin. And in the East, they're continuing to use Greek. But we don't have many people who know both and are able to kind of spread ideas between the two. And so they start developing further and further apart as the centuries progress. And this takes place in basically across the entire theological spectrum. So what I want to do now is just to kind of give you a little list of some of the key points of difference between these two cultures that emerge, especially as we get closer to the year 1000 and this kind of decisive break between East and West in 1054. The first, and as I already said, perhaps the most important difference between the two is, of course, the language. Latin in the West, Greek in the East. So we've already talked about that. What other issues are there dividing these two? Well, another thing that we mentioned earlier in the course is a difference in the character or the tone of the theology. In the western part of Christendom, in the Latin-speaking part of the Christian world, the theology has more of a Roman Latin flavor or character to it, right? And the Romans, when we think about the Romans, what do we think about? We think about efficiency, we think about organization, we think about law. And this is, stereotyping, but there's some truth to that stereotype. And Latin theology tends to be similar. It tends to be sort of practical, no nonsense, very focused on making clear distinctions. It has kind of a legal overtone to it. And we'll see some of these features when we talk about the development of medieval Western theology in an upcoming module. But this character of Latin theology, we can see it all the way back even really when you look at Tertullian. You can see it in Augustine, although Augustine has a significant philosophical aspect to him. But in the figures after Augustine, this legal kind of practical emphasis in the theology is very clear. Right? What is the real big theological debate in the Latin patristic world? It's Pelagianism, right? It's a question of legalism. It's a question of how do we get salvation, a very practical question focused on very practical issues like works versus grace and judgments of God on sin. In the East, things are different. Things are more philosophical. Things are more mystical and speculative. Right? The big heresy, the big controversy in the East is about the nature of God, the nature of the Trinity. We don't want to make too much of this difference, right? There's a great deal of overlap between the two. But there is a noticeable difference in the character of the theology, right? When you read the Eastern Fathers, they tend to be more philosophical. They tend to be more mystical. They tend to be more open to embracing mystery and leaving things undefined. In the West, there's a much greater focus on order and legal definition sort of mindset when we look at things. So that, again, parallels this difference in language, with Latin being a much simpler, in some ways, more practical language, and Greek being more philosophical, more nuanced, more complicated, really. Okay, so those are kind of characteristic differences. Let's get down to, well, what are the actual substantive differences between the two that develop? Well, one comes when we look at the discussion of the Trinity. Now, again, this is not an issue of heresy versus orthodoxy. We've talked about a number of times in earlier modules how in the history of doctrinal development, what tends to happen is that the church sets certain boundaries, but that within those boundaries there can be freedom for speculation, freedom for dialogue, and there can be different emphases that still fall within the boundaries of orthodoxy. Right? And so within the boundaries set up by the church in terms of how we ought to think about the Trinity, there can be different emphases, right? We have the three and we have the one. So in the West, in the Latin-speaking West, the emphasis is on the one, right? That Latin-speaking theology tends to focus on God being one, there being one God, who is then also three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In the East, they tend to turn that around, right? So the tendency is to begin with the three persons and then say, yes, there are these three persons who are also one God. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those approaches a little later in the module, but that's just the biggest of these differences to keep in mind as we look at some of these others here before returning to the Trinity a little later. Along with that difference in emphasis when it comes to the Trinity, there's a difference in emphasis when it comes to thinking about salvation. Now again, this is not a question of heresy versus orthodoxy, it's a question of emphasis. But in the Latin-speaking West, the emphasis in thinking about salvation tends to be on justification. That is, how do we get deemed to be in a right relationship with God? How are the guilt and punishment due to sin and to original sin dealt with so that we can be in a proper relationship with God? Western Christianity tends to look at salvation in those terms, following Augustine largely. And in the East, the emphasis is much more on something that we've talked about before, this idea of theosis, a more metaphysical way of thinking about salvation, if you will. Right? That salvation is understood as a process of the human person, human nature, becoming more and more divine. So again, both would affirm the other side as a valid part of understanding salvation, but they tend to emphasize different aspects when they think about and write about salvation. There's also important differences in ecclesiology. And here is maybe where we would say there are actual concrete doctrinal differences between the two. In the Latin-speaking West, you get a gradual but over time very substantial development in the understanding of ecclesiology and church authority that emphasizes the role of Rome and the role of the Roman pontiff, the Pope, as being the ultimate authority in the church. Now, as Catholics, we would say that this is a legitimate doctrinal development. Now, it's important to admit and to acknowledge, right, in the first century, nobody would have explained or defined the papacy in the way that, say, modern-day Catholics do, or the way that the Council of Trent or Vatican I would do. Those kinds of definitions weren't around at that period. We would say instead the foundations for the Catholic understanding of the papacy are there in the first century, but it takes a number of centuries for those foundations to get developed into the understanding that we have today. Now, part of, it seems, why that happens in the West and not the East is there is an important geographical difference. When you look at the ancient Christian world and the Roman Empire, when we divide it between East and West, there is only one city that would claim a patriarch in the ancient Roman Christian world, and that would be Rome, right? That there were a number of important cities in early Christianity, that would claim a patriarch, right? That would claim not just a bishop, but a leader of the Christian world in an entire region, which we would call a patriarch. And it's only in Rome, in the western part of the Christian world, that you have a patriarch. In the East, in the Greek-speaking East, there are a number of them, right? You have Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, and then little later you get Constantinople as well. So you have 4 of these patriarchs in the Greek-speaking East and only 1 in the West. So it's perhaps not surprising that in the West, this understanding of Roman authority develops much quicker and in a different way than in the East. The East, early on, acknowledges that Rome has a particular honor, a particular priority over the other patriarchs. But as the centuries progress and as Roman power increases, the Greek-speaking East is very hesitant about this and does not want to concede any particular authority to Rome. And so they will instead emphasize that all of these patriarchates share kind of an authority in the church. And so they would see Rome as one of many, along with Constantinople and Antioch and Jerusalem. Whereas in the Latin-speaking West, they would see Rome as the one ultimate authority. And this is going to be a crucial point of contention between the two sides when the break finally occurs in 1054. Along with this, right, when you have these 5 patriarchates, when they come to defining their zones of influence, if you will, their regions where they have authority, not surprisingly, there are some contested spots. And so there was debate about who had authority in certain areas, particularly between Rome and Constantinople. And so again, this question of jurisdiction and of authority is going to be an important division point between the two sides as this division grows leading up to 1054. Now, along with those big issues of how we think about the Trinity, how do we conceive of salvation, who has authority in what regions, and does Rome have an authority or primacy over the other patriarchs, along with these really big issues, there are also a whole host of cultural differences between East and West that play an important role in the division between the two halves of the Christian world. Now, we can't begin to cover all of them here, but there are a couple we already mentioned in the intro that we'll just look at as sort of indicative of the differences. And these are 2 differences between East and West that actually come up frequently in the literature. So when the Eastern Greek Christians write their condemnations of the Latin West, they will talk about beards and bread, and the West will do the same when writing about the East. And this may seem odd to us, right, that people would really divide the church over things like beards or things like what kind of bread you use in the Eucharist. But again, think about our own day. Think about the outcry that always comes up if there's a small change proposed in, say, the translation of the Mass or the order of prayers or other things in the liturgy. People get very adamant about these things. People are very passionate about these things. And so they may not be huge theological issues like the nature of the Trinity, but people feel a great commitment to an investment in their liturgy, their traditions. And so to have significant differences when you come to things like the bread used in the Eucharist or how your clergy look, these are things that really are significant in the day-to-day lives of the people. We've talked about lex orandi, lex credendi. What we do in prayer, what we do in the daily life of our faith shapes our doctrine. Now, I don't know that beards and bread shape doctrine in an important way, but it's just another point of how important the day-to-day practice of the faith is when it comes to understanding our faith, understanding the church. So we have the issue of beards, right? What's going on here? In the Latin West, what happens over time is that the clergy start to shave. And so you end up with Roman clergy, Catholic clergy, Latin-speaking clergy, shave, and those in the East do not and tend to grow their beards out. Now there are arguments made on both sides, right? And so in the East, they will condemn the Latin-speaking shaven clergy. And in fact, one of the key fights between the East and West and the schism that ultimately separates the two is the question of whether or not the Greek-speaking East would admit shaved clergy to the Eucharist, and they were denying them from coming to the Eucharist. The Greek-speaking East argued that shaving was basically effeminate, right? That you were confusing the genders to take it as extreme a length as possible. You were becoming effeminate if you shaved and not embracing manliness. They would also point to the passage in Leviticus that would talk about for Jewish men that they're not supposed to trim their beards. And so the Greeks would accuse the Latins of violating this biblical mandate and also of being effeminate. On the other hand, the Latin-speaking clergy condemned the Greeks for their beards, right? And now the arguments here, it's not entirely clear how much theological substance there is to it. It has been proposed that one of the issues is when you look in St. Paul's discussion of long hair being kind of not natural for a man. Some of the Latin authors tried to include the Greek long beards in that, although that seems a little bit of a stretch. But this was a real debate, and the Latin-speaking West insisted on the validity of their custom of shaving. Now, does this ultimately make a difference? Does it really make a difference if one has a beard or not? You know, it seems to me that I don't see any or experience any real difference in my spiritual well-being whether or not I have a beard. But this was a real issue at the time. Along with the beards, right, is this question we mentioned before of bread. What kind of bread should we use for the Eucharist? In the East, they used leavened bread, right? And so they would use bread very similar to the kind of bread that we would eat on a day-to-day basis. Of course, not in a little cellophane package from the Wonder Plant down at Dillon's, but they would use loaves of bread like you would find in any baker's shop, even into modern-day Europe. In the West, they began to use unleavened bread. Now, I think most people agree that in the early centuries, many Christians used leavened bread, but the West uses unleavened bread. And in fact, what ultimately is argued in the Latin-speaking West is that either kind of bread is valid for celebrating the Eucharist. But it becomes the tradition in the West to use unleavened bread. Now, why? Well, again, there are a lot of issues that come up in this debate. One of the big questions is whether or not Jesus used leavened or unleavened bread at the Last Supper. Is this a Passover meal or is it not? Is he using leavened bread or is he using this special unleavened bread from Jewish practice? And so people debate this to support their side. The Greek-speaking East argues that leavened bread is a better symbol of the Eucharist in that it is alive, right? That you have this living yeast in the bread that enlivens it, and that the Western unleavened bread is this dead thing that's not real bread. And so again, there are a lot of arguments made about this. How much theological substance is there? Not clear to me that there's a great deal of difference, of substantive difference there, but it becomes very important in terms of defending the traditions of your church, defending the traditions that your family has had for generations. And so again, along with the beards, this question of what kind of bread is used is a very big controversy and gets listed in these denunciations that both sides make of the other leading up to the big schism in 1054. Okay, so now that we've run through some of these important differences between East and West, stretching all the way from the language they use to the kind of bread that they use in the Eucharist, I want to step back for a minute and talk a little bit about these different approaches to the Trinity that the two sides of Christianity have. Because understanding their approach to the Trinity is going to be crucial for us to understand then the main doctrinal difference between the two, which is the filioque controversy. To skip a little ahead, the filioque controversy refers to the debate between the East and West about the Latin inclusion of this phrase filioque, or really a word which means "and the Son," in Latin, in the Latin form of the Creed. This is something that the Latin Church introduces many centuries after the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed was put together in 381. And the Greek-speaking East reacts very strongly against this inclusion of "and the Son" to talk about the procession of the Spirit in the Creed. But before we can understand why this is such a big issue between the two, we need to think about and talk a little bit about the two different approaches to the Trinity. So let's start with the Latin-speaking West, right? The Latin-speaking West, as I said a few minutes ago, begins with and emphasizes the unity of God, right? So they'll begin with the one, and then talk about how this one God exists in three persons. And so, well, what can we say about this? Well, without getting into a whole lot of technical detail, one thing we can obviously say is that this is really going to emphasize the divine unity, right? This is going to be seen as one of our main goals in a Latin view of the Trinity, is to avoid tritheism, to avoid the idea of three gods, right? We're really going to emphasize, no, there is really only one God, even though we will talk about three persons in this one God. So that's going to be one of the key things that we're going to want to defend. Now, when we go to talk about, well, how do we describe these three persons in the one God, one of the things that is emphasized in the West is trying to make sure that there are real meaningful things, meaningful distinctions between these three persons, particularly distinctions rooted in the relationships between them, right? So the way the three persons are understood in the West is going to be directly connected to, well, what are the relationships of each person to the other persons? And this is where we get the filioque developing, right? If you look at a Latin understanding of the three persons, right? The Father is the source of both the Son and the Spirit, right? So that makes him distinctive, right? The Father is not, there's no other person who is a source of the Father. So that's going to kind of define him. Now, if we just have the Father being the source of the Son and the source of the Spirit, then from a Latin way of looking at it, the Son and the Spirit basically look the same, right? They are both persons who come from, in some way, the Father. So how are we going to keep them distinct? Well, in the Latin West, they will say there is a difference, right? That the Son is begotten by the Father. So the Son comes only from the Father. He is begotten by the Father. So that makes him different from the Father, and he's begotten from a person. But the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, right? And so in terms of, well, who is the source in some way of the Spirit? Well, the Latin-speaking West will say both Father and Son play a role in the procession of the Spirit. So if you will, kind of the Son has one source, and in some way the Spirit then has two. And so this is a way we can tell the three persons, keep the three persons distinct, is these relationships between them, in that the Son is begotten by the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And that's that key phrase in Latin, filioque, and the Son. So the Latin-speaking approach is going to emphasize these differences in relationships as the way we keep the persons distinct. Now they're also going to root this, right? This isn't just philosophy for them, right? They're going to say that this comes directly from looking at Scripture, right? We talked in a previous module about the economic and the immanent Trinity, right? The immanent Trinity is thinking about the Trinity in terms of God's nature in and of itself, right? How do the three persons relate to one another as God, without relation to or connection to our world or to human beings. The economic Trinity talks about the relation of the three persons to us and to the world. And when we read Scripture and we see how it describes the Father, Son, and Spirit acting, the Latin-speaking West will point to passages where the Son will send the Spirit to people. And so they will say, this image that we can take from the economic Trinity of the Son sending the Spirit gives us insight into the immanent Trinity, right? And so it gives us reason to believe that the Son plays a role in the Spirit's procession along with the Father, right? And so they would say there's scriptural basis for this idea of the Spirit proceeding from the Father and from the Son. Now, those are some of the motivations behind the Latin-speaking approach to the Trinity, but there are, of course, dangers, right? And in all these different tensions that we look at in the faith, there's always a danger of pushing your point of emphasis too far, right? And so obviously, if you're going to emphasize the one, the danger there would be to take it so far that you undermine the reality of the three in God. So the danger here is modalism, right, or Sabellianism, which is the heresy that says there's really only one God, and the three persons are just ways that one God appears at certain times or in certain places. So that's the potential heresy that the Latin approach could reach if you were to push it too far, would be to deny the reality of these three distinct persons in the one God. There's also a danger of creating a quadernity. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you take this Latin approach and aren't careful about it, you can end up basically creating this fourth thing, which would be the divine nature that somehow exists apart from or maybe before the three persons, right? So you have to be careful in the Latin approach to not set up the divine nature as something outside of or distinct from Father, Son, and Spirit, because then you have these four things in God, which would also be obviously problematic. And then finally, there's a danger of, by emphasizing the role of the Son in the procession of the Spirit, that you can kind of make the Holy Spirit subordinate to the other two, right? That if you're not careful, you can have a Father who's the source of both Son and Spirit, and the Son who's the plays a role in the procession of the Spirit, and then you end up with the Spirit that looks like not really doing anything, and so seen as kind of a less than member of the Trinity. So that's another danger to be avoided in the Latin approach. But that's some of just an overview of the motivations and strengths of the Latin approach, and some of the possible pitfalls if you carry it too far. If we change gears and look for a few minutes at the Greek approach to the Trinity, in many ways what we get is sort of the mirror image or some of the opposite emphases. Right? As I said before, the emphasis here is to begin with and focus on the three persons. So you'll focus on Father, Son, and Spirit, and then talk about how those three persons are also one God and are in fact three gods. There's a real nuanced vocabulary that the Greek theologians will use to talk about this, and specifically distinct terminology to talk about the difference between the Son being begotten from the Father and the Spirit being processing, or they would use the term spirating or being spirated from the Father. And so they would say that the way the Father is a source for the Son and for the Spirit, those two things are different. And so they have a kind of nuanced vocabulary to talk about that. In the East, again, there's a real emphasis on the Father as being the unique source of the two other persons, and therefore really being the source of unity in the Godhead, right? And so for them, it will be the Father who ensures that there is this one God and not three. Now, what is their motivation in emphasizing Father, Son, and Spirit, and then talking about how it's also one God? Well, one key emphasis here is to avoid modalism, right? And so they would see kind of a Latin approach as being dangerous and undermining the reality of the three distinct persons in God. So they want to make sure that doesn't happen and emphasize the three persons and avoid any possibility of modalism. They also want to maintain the Father's unique status as a source of the other persons, right? And they would say, when you make the Son part of the procession of the Spirit, you are undermining the Father's identity as the one source of the other two persons, and you're putting the Son kind of along with the Father in that role of source, which they would see as a confusion of the persons. All right, then now what's the danger of this Greek approach if we take it too far? Well, the obvious danger here would be tritheism, right? That if you emphasize the three persons too much, you can get to the point where you really undermine the unity of God, and you end up with three divine beings, the Father, Son, and Spirit. I think the other key problem, say that a Latin theologian might point out, is that it's not clear what the real distinction is between Son and Spirit in this way of approaching things, right? That if you use a different term, spirating versus begetting, that's great, but what's the real difference, right? What is the underlying reality behind those different terms? And there's not really any clear way that we could, as human beings, understand the difference between how the Son is begotten by the Father versus the Spirit being spirated by the Father. And so the Latin West would say, basically you end up making the Son and Spirit essentially the same. You're just using a different term, a different vocabulary to talk about them. So that would be one danger that the Latins would see with this Greek approach. Now, at the end of the day, if we avoid the extremes on either side, as we've said before, right, both of these approaches could fall within the boundaries set by the Church for thinking about how the Trinity works. But these different emphases do have real results, right? And in the West, this way of thinking about the Trinity leads ultimately to the inclusion of the filioque in the Creed, and that in turn plays a role in the ultimate break between the Eastern and Western churches. What exactly is the filioque? Well, again, as I said before, it's this inclusion of and the Son in the Creed that happens in the Latin-speaking West. A little more detail about that would be to say that this is something that starts not at Rome. There's no pope that sits down and decides to add this Latin term to the Creed. In fact, it seems to start kind of out in the missionary field, if you will. Specifically, sometime in the 7th century, so in the 600s, in Western Christian world, you start to see this phrase appearing. And scholars think that this happens in part to deal with Arianism, right? And to insist on the Son's true equality with the Father. And so the Latin-speaking Western churchmen find this as a useful addition to the Creed. Now, and it also, to be fair, I think, and even many Greek theologians would agree with this, there is precedent for this, right? It's not included in the original Nicene Creed, but there is precedence for this idea of the Spirit proceeding from the Father through the Son in patristic literature, particularly even in the Greek-speaking church father Gregory of Nyssa. He'll talk about the Son playing a role in the procession of the Spirit, that it happens through the Son. And so it wasn't necessarily a huge innovation for these Western churchmen to start using this in the Creed. However, it was an ecumenical creed, right? And the text was agreed upon by all the bishops. So this becomes a real issue in terms of church authority and precedent and leadership. Once this begins to be debated, of course, with the growing understanding of the authority of the papacy in the West, they would argue that the Pope would have the authority to include this in the Creed, even without another ecumenical council. And of course, in the East, they're going to deny that. Now, interestingly, The first pope that really addresses this, who is Pope Leo III, he rejects this, right? He says, no, look, this phrase is not in the original of the creed, therefore we're not going to include it. And he dies in the early 800s. But in the years after him, it starts to gain favor, and eventually the popes do approve of its inclusion, and this helps lead to some of the decisive breaks between the Eastern and Western churches. Now, as I said at the opening of the module, the split that happens in 1054 is really only the final straw, if you will, in a very long process of growing division between Eastern and Western Christianity. And I'm not going to go over all of that here now. Let me just highlight a couple of key points in this process and beyond 1054, leading up to our own day. The kind of first real significant break between the East and West is called the Photian Schism. And the Photian Schism is named after Photius, who was the patriarch or the Archbishop of Constantinople, and he excommunicates the Pope, and the Pope excommunicates him, and they fight about basically many of the issues that we've already discussed. These differences in liturgical custom, but also differences in regard to the understanding of church authority and the understanding of the Trinity, and particularly this filioque clause. Now, as part of this, Photius's ordination and installation as Bishop of Constantinople was problematic. There was a lot of political upheaval during this period, and Rome argued that he was not legitimate as the bishop, and eventually Photius does get deposed and exiled. And then once he's gone, there's a reunion between Constantinople and Rome. But this was a really significant break that lasted a number of years and was kind of a precursor to what was to come a century or so later, leading up to then the big break in 1054. And here, the kind of actual historical process is very similar to what happened in the Photian Schism. There's another Archbishop of Constantinople, Michael Solarius, and he condemns the Latins for, again, many of these same issues, both liturgical practices and theology, and the filioque. And in turn, the Latin Pope, Pope Leo IX, condemns and excommunicates him, and so that is the excommunication of the two sides of one another in 1054 that has remained up until this day. And both of them kind of write extensively about the errors of the other side, and really kind of formalize these differences in culture and these differences in theology, and especially maybe these fights about ultimate church authority. And again, and that break between the two that happens in 1054 persists into the current day. Now, since 1054, there have been a number of attempts to reunify the Christian world. Even prior to the Photian Schism, there were other schisms between the two halves of Christianity that took place, but then they reconciled, and the Photian Schism was pretty significant, but it was reconciled. And then 1054 happens, and we get this split, but there was every reason for many people at the time to believe that this too would be overcome and the two sides would come back together. But that doesn't happen, and the split persists longer and longer and longer, and so people start to wonder if it is going to be resolved, but people continue to try to do something about it. The most significant attempt to bring the two sides back together is centered on the Council of Florence, which happens in the 1400s. So this was, from the Latin perspective, an ecumenical council, although the Greek-speaking East has rejected the Council of Florence as being legitimate, because ultimately they end up rejecting what is agreed to at the Council of Florence. But in the 1400s, council is called at Florence in an attempt to deal with this divide between East and West. Now, what has happened in the 400 years or so since the break, well, there's a whole lot, obviously, a lot has happened in 400 years. In very broad terms, in the Western world, things have continued to grow and develop, and the Western world is doing pretty well, right? We're getting up through the Middle Ages. We're on the verge of the Renaissance. There's a lot of growth of city and trade and all kinds of things happening. In the East, things are looking much rougher, and that with the spread of Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire and Eastern Christianity are very much in peril. And so when these representatives from the Eastern Church agree to come to this Council of Florence, it's not exactly a meeting of equals, right? That the Western Church, while it has its rough patches, is doing quite well. And the representatives from the East are in many ways there because they're being forced to seek reconciliation with the West in order to save themselves politically and militarily, because the spread of Islam is basically threatening to eliminate the Eastern Christian world, which in fact, of course, happens shortly thereafter. But they come to the Council of Florence, and at that council, basically, there are a number of things that happen. The Eastern representatives are not treated terribly well. They were not housed well, not fed well. They're in this foreign city. Their lands are in peril back home. So basically, they are being, you could see, coerced into making some concessions in terms of theology and church authority. But ultimately, the representatives from the East do agree with the Western propositions for theological concessions, church authority concessions that will allow the two to come back together. So the Eastern representatives agree to this. They go back to Constantinople. Not surprisingly, when they get back, they are denounced and the agreement is rejected. The Eastern Christians feel they have been treated very poorly, and they reject what was agreed to at the council. And really, that was the last possibility for reconciliation between East and West for many centuries thereafter. Skipping 500 years or so, coming to our own day, where do things stand now? Well, that failure of the Council of Florence pretty much defined things for centuries. This break between the two was seen as kind of more or less complete and final. But the last few decades have seen real efforts to kind of bridge that gap. Starting back in Vatican II, but especially under the pontificates of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, there have been real efforts to try to heal this divide between the East and the West. And so if you look at modern statements by the Vatican about the East, they are very positive in tone, especially if you compare them to things from earlier centuries or even the early 1900s. So if you look, for example, at the document Dominus Jesus, put out by the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith when Cardinal Ratzinger was in charge of it under John Paul II, and of course Cardinal Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict XVI. Dominus Jesus looks at other religions and other Christian traditions and drew a lot of criticism because it insisted that the Catholic Church is the one true church and the one way God interacts with and sends grace to everyone. Now it admitted that God's grace could reach outside of the visible church, could reach even into those of other religious traditions and certainly into other Christian traditions. But it doesn't call, for example, say the Baptist Church a church in the full sense of being having valid ordinations and valid sacraments and things like this. The one other tradition that is referred to as a church and referred to more or less as an equal that's been separated is, of course, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so Dominus Jesus very clearly describes the Eastern Church as a true church and one where the problem is one of organizational ecclesial division and not clear breach in terms of doctrine or another religion, certainly. And if you look at the efforts of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, both tried very earnestly to work to overcome this division. If you look, both of them worked with the Patriarch of Constantinople to try to resolve issues. They would pray with the Patriarch. There is a famous instance where Pope Benedict even recited the Creed together with the Patriarch of Constantinople, and he did so leaving out the Filioque. So he recited the Creed without that addition. Now, of course, this upset some very traditional Catholics quite a bit. They saw this as a concession of Rome's authority by Pope Benedict. But Benedict, I think you could argue, is very much following tradition. He's very much acting in the spirit, I think, of the fathers who wrote the Creed initially. If you remember back to the Cappadocians and their decision to not insist on the homoousion when it comes to the spirit, their goal was church unity was more important than imposing terminology. And I think Pope Benedict is acting very much in that spirit in reciting the Creed without the Filioque, which is certainly a valid form. It was approved by the councils and the church fathers. And while the Filioque, he did not deny the validity of it, he omitted it out of a desire for unity. Now, it would be nice if there had been real substantial results from this. There have been different groups, especially among theologians, who have worked to build on this effort by the popes. And there have been agreements in theological dialogue between Orthodox and Catholic theologians. In terms of real concrete developments of the two churches reuniting, there hasn't been a great deal of progress. Well, why is that? Well, there are a lot of reasons. There still are significant cultural differences between the two. And that would take a great deal to overcome and to address. There's also real kind of pragmatic difficulties, especially when it comes to the Orthodox participation in this. So when the Pope would dialogue with the Patriarch of Constantinople, it's not necessarily a dialogue of equals, right? The Patriarch of Constantinople is currently in modern day Istanbul, right? And so the Patriarch of Constantinople is not like the Pope in having his own kind of vast ecclesial territory. The Patriarch of Constantinople basically has a building in modern day Istanbul, which the government of Turkey allows him to have authority in. And there's other problems as well, of course, right? There are multiple patriarchs in Eastern Christianity. And so while the Patriarch of Constantinople has kind of an honorific place of authority, he certainly can't negotiate with the Pope on behalf of all the other patriarchs. There are real power divisions in Eastern Christianity that aren't reflected in, say, the West. There's also just the real difference in terms of numbers and wealth and power, with Western Christianity having grown a great deal in the centuries since the break, while Eastern Christianity has remained relatively smaller and has many more challenges when it comes to its political situation. And so for a lot of those reasons, and this is a big complex topic, but it would be very difficult for the East to kind of negotiate with the Catholic Church in the form of equals coming together. And so there's a lot of resistance from many within the Eastern churches towards dialogue with Rome, because they would see Rome as having just a very significant advantage in any sort of dialogue or negotiation that would take place. So for the time being, those efforts by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict have not really seen real fruit in terms of the reunion of these two churches. That being said, we've looked at a lot of different controversies, and some of these controversies do last over centuries. And given that We can believe that the Spirit is still at work guiding the church. Who's to say that there could not ultimately be a reunion of the two in some way? That doesn't look to be imminent in our near future, but again, God works in mysterious ways that we see many times in this course. So we can all pray, of course, that maybe someday God will work in a way that will bring the two halves of Christianity back together again. In the meantime, though, we will leave this discussion for now, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this and on the readings that I'll give you on Blackboard on the discussion boards.